Here we're going to work on this part of the scarf. First, draw the scarf on the fabric. Cut off the seat seam with a 5mm margin. The size I'm doing right now, the ring above is not round. You don't need to worry about this. Just give it to it like this. Just cut a small opening in it, about 5mm of seam. The size we have at this position is round and smooth. Anyway, we all leave a 5mm seam allowance. Then we will mark the ends of each line. Draw all these lines. I made the middle line quite long. The main line in the middle is the center line. The center line does not need to be folded. Apart from the center line, the remaining lines need to be folded. Then let's take a look at our diagram. Some lines have a black dot. We mark these lines that have black dots. These lines that are marked, we all do it this way. Fold it upwards towards the front like this. The position of the fold corresponds to the position of the line. Lines that do not have marked points, we simply fold it down. Fold it towards the reverse side. Use the center line as a guide. We push all the lines on the right to the left like this. Wait a moment, fold the center line to the left side of these lines. Then push all of them over to this side on the right. But we will leave this step to fold later. Just now I mentioned this step. The edge hasn't been clearly highlighted yet. Let me show you the general way to fold it. Normally we should finish the edge first, then we can perform this step. Fold the edge upwards on the front side of the scarf. If your edge has a right side and a wrong side, it is directly opposite because the scarf has a curve. But our edging does not need to be folded, so it might be difficult to fold in these corners. We can make some cuts in advance on the edging. Do not cut too deep. Cut about 2mm. You also cannot make triangular cuts. If it is cut into that shape, the edging will easily come apart. You can pre-stitch the cut like this. You can also mention stitching to the curved parts. Then you can start stitching the cut. There's still time for everything. Then let's discuss the stitching points. Because our slip edge is hollow, you can easily see the design line at the bottom edge. We can sew directly along the design line. The position of the design line is to the left. It's the exposed part of our slip edge. Going to the right is the style of this edge. If you want the exposed part of this edge to be bigger, you can move your edge a bit to the left if you want to make the edge narrower. Then you can move it a bit to the right. This depends on your personal preference. I should have it exposed by about 1 unit. It's approximately 5 or 6mm, like our car is on this side. I didn't make a cut here in the front. We can revisit this step to make the cuts. There is still time. After completing the work, turn it over. This way, the pattern will be more apparent. We will make some cuts at the curved areas of this pattern. After making the cuts, we press down on the structure. Flip the edge over to the front side. Directly draw a clear line at the edge to secure it. The straight lines on both sides outline the pattern at this position. Fold towards the back along this line of the pattern. Additionally, each car is secured with a distinct line. After securing this style, it can be trimmed slightly. Just leave a margin of 2 to 3mm. The other side should also be trimmed. At this point, you might think our edge isn't smooth enough. For now, let's overlook this detail. We'll follow the folding method discussed before sewing the edge. After folding and pressing these lines properly, the edge will also become smooth. Once everything is folded, it looks like this. Then we shape it with steam. This is how it looks after shaping with steam. The borders at the bottom have also been smoothed out. Next, we mark a line at the top. Let it remain fixed for now. We tug this line towards the edge. Because this is just a temporary fix. Once finished, this scarf will be kept for later. Our sleeves are divided into upper and lower sections. We need to add a layer of finishing. Then connect the upper part and the lower part flat together. So here, we will first handle the edge drawing part. We will use the dimensions specified in the drawing for the edge drawing. No extra seams need to be added. Then we will fold it in half. The fold position can be smoothed out with an iron. After ironing, it looks like this when opened. Then on this side where it opens, draw a 5mm seam line on it. It's not the fold position, it's on the opening side. Next, we will perform the double line gathering on both the left and right sides of this seam line. Mark a gathering line at about 2mm on each side. The line spacing for the gathering line should be set to 4. Do not backstitch at either end. After folding, we simultaneously pull tight both bottom threads. Pull out the gathered fold. One side feels tighter now. We can switch to pulling the bottom thread on the other side. The dimensions after the fold should match this sleeve. The dimensions of the bottom edge of the upper section are consistent after the length has been adjusted. We are joining them together face to face. Align them vertically and sew along the seam line. Check the folds yourself after completing them. If there are no problems, we will take out the basting line we just created. Next, we will take out the lower half of the sleeve. Take the upper section we just worked on and position it face to face with the lower half. Sew along the line we just used for the lace. Once done, flip it to the front side. We will sew to the marked line at this spot. Make it a little smoother. Once it's sewn together, we'll work on the bottom edge here and create a double line pleat on it. The double line pleat is similar to the lace we sewed earlier. I won't repeat it here. Just make sure to pleat this spot well. The dimension after the pleat. It matches our cuff size. Now let's discuss our cuff. This section of the cuff. I have pressed it with a light layer. Due to this cuff, its overall area is quite large. If it is not pressed, it will make this section of the cuff appear very thin. It lacks any shape. My personal recommendation is you don't need to iron the small fabric. For the other sizes, it is recommended to iron the thin fabric. Just choose the thinnest fabric for summer, unless the fabric you choose is particularly thick, usually around 60 or 80 units. I generally recommend ironing the fabric. After the bottom edge is gathered and folded, this fold here, try to position it towards the middle as much as possible. This gathered size at the bottom edge of the sleeve. Adjust it to match the width of our cuff. Then we will sew them together with the right sides facing each other. After folding, check the fold yourself. If it feels fine, then remove the temporary fold line we just made. Then we will take the bottom edge of this cuff, fold it towards the wrong side along the stitching line. After folding, you can press it here. I have already pressed it here. Then we will fold this part up. The edge position is just right to cover the cuff below. This seam at the splicing position, cover it. Then we turn it to the front, so a clear line to secure it. After removing, the front looks like this, the back looks like this. Let's start with the collar here. As for the collar, our pattern looks like this. The arc at the top is relatively small. The curvature below is slightly larger. We are not sewing the line at the bottom right now. We need to sew the line on top. Everyone, please be careful not to sew in the wrong direction. When sewing, make sure to extend the front and back outward more. A 5mm seam allowance should be extended. Here, I have 2 identical pieces of fabric stacked vertically. Place them together with the fronts facing each other. The pattern is drawn on one of the pieces. The position on the fabric is acceptable. Take a look at the seam. The stitching on this car, both ends extend outwards by an additional 5mm. Then let's do some trimming. The position I just sewed on the car. The position of this line can be trimmed with lace scissors. No lace scissors, just leave a style of 2 or 3mm. Then cut some notches by yourself. The remaining positions should leave a space of 5mm as a guideline. You can simply use regular scissors to cut it. Once cut, we will unfold these 2 pieces. Flip it over and fold it slightly. Place the backs of these 2 pieces together and stack them. The crease is the spot where we just stitched. You can press it with an iron, make it a little flatter. Once completed, it looks like this. This is the seam line. I only have it on one of the fabric pieces. There is no other piece. Everyone can draw this style on the other piece themselves. Also mark the line. This will make it easier for us to proceed to the next step. Here we take out the front and back pieces of the outer fabric and the lining. Here are the outer fabric and lining. I'm using the same fabric for both. They are all made of this 80 count high-density cotton. The method for sewing the pointed seams of the lining and outer fabric. They are all the same. I'll start by demonstrating using the tablecloth. Sew the pointed seam of the front and back pieces together with the right sides facing each other. Next, we will unfold the front and back pieces. The pointed seam in the middle should be pressed open to the sides. You can press it with an iron. Alternatively, you can use your fingernail to smooth it out. Smooth it out a bit. Next, take out the 2 sleeves. Fold the upper part of the sleeves at this point. Locate its end point. Make marks on the back side of the fabric. Then take out the front and back pieces of our fabric. Then gather the sleeves at this position. This is also facing the right side. The curves at these 2 positions are different, so we need to sew while aligning this curve. If you're not confident, just sew directly. You can also use a bamboo needle to secure it first before sewing. Be careful when you reach the pointed seam position. This is the center mark we just made. We need to align this position of the pointed seam. This marker is meant to assist us in aligning. After both sleeves have been attached, we take out this ceremonial fabric. The ceremonial fabric and the main fabric are facing each other. Align them this way. We'll sew the straight line along the back opening. Be careful while sewing. We shouldn't sew it all the way. We will sew down the neckline to about 2/3 of the way. Both sides are identical. There's no need for extreme precision. A rough idea will suffice. Begin sewing from this upper side. The sewing part of the top section also needs to be stitched. This is how it looks once both sides are sewn. Only this part has stitching. Next, we turn it over. Position the lining and outer fabric so they face each other. This spot that I'm currently holding. This is the position we just stitched. Now the stitching on our neckline is at this spot. We are slightly to the right of the stitching on the neckline. 2 to 3mm is acceptable. This is just temporarily attaching the lining and outer fabric. Secure the neckline position together. Check it after stitching. The fixing line is only within the stitching. This is the fixation for the neckline. If you don't secure it, the lining and the outer fabric are 2 separate layers. Attaching the collar later won't be as easy. If it's just one layer, attaching the collar will be easier. Now let's move on to the next step. I didn't record this step. It feels odd to have recorded both sides. This step was overlooked on both sides. Here we continue from the last step. This area around the collar. We have sewn the lining and the outer fabric together. I've stitched a line here because I picked this up on a whim. It also doesn't have sleeves here. We mainly just need to focus on this neckline area, the locations of these 2 diagonal lines. It's the spot where the front and back pieces are sewn and the pointed seams are located. Here, we will align the 2 pointed seam locations. Identify a center point for this neckline position on the front piece. Mark the center point. Then take out the scarf we prepared earlier. I folded this scarf casually as well. Speaking of our scarf, it certainly has a central position. Please mark this central position. Align it with the 2 marked points at the top and bottom. Then, the stitching at the bottom now is done in this position, correct? We need to shift slightly to the right on this scarf. temporarily stitch it to secure it? Just stitch it slightly to the right, and it will be fine. Temporarily fix the measuring pin at this position. Next, take out the collar we prepared earlier. Draw the stitching line on both pieces of fabric. Now pay attention to this collar. If your collar also has a reverse side, my two pieces of fabric are the same. If you also have these two pieces, for example, one of the pieces has a pattern, then fold the side with the pattern. If you want this side to be the front, fold it in half. Find the center point, which we'll address shortly. We sew to this position on the scarf. When positioning the center point, it should be aligned. We have a seam line at the front and back. I forgot to draw the seam line at the front. I will also draw the seam lines for the front and back. When sewing here, the area where we have the seam line is aligned with the opening at the back below. Align the edge position. This means it should extend one seam's distance beyond the bottom. Then we sew forward along this vertical seam line. When we reach the center point of the collar, above this collar, we need to align the marked point we made. Then continue to sew forward along the vertical seam line. Sew all the way to the final position. This refers to the seam line on our collar and the bottom. Align with the edge position of the back opening. There is an additional seam compared to the one below. Now let's go back to the regular video. It's the position I've pointed to with my hand. It's the seam position we just stitched. I'd like to take a moment to explain this seam. If you're working with smaller sizes, for instance, small fabric around 6 inches, you might need to trim this seam slightly. Otherwise, at the end, when you wrap it this way, this area might be too old-fashioned or not cover well because I'm currently working with larger sizes. So it can be covered here, so I didn't trim it. Everyone can decide whether to trim or sew based on the actual circumstances. Then here, I recommend using this type of Water Dragon double-sided tape. The neckline has a rounded shape. We use Water Dragon double-sided tape to secure this inner part. Just wait a moment while sewing the side seams. It will be somewhat easier. If you are confident about sewing the side seams, it's fine if we don't secure it. It's up to you. I recommend that beginners prepare a double-sided tape like this. You can also use it for other things. We'll stick it directly onto the inner seam of the collar, the area where the seam folds inward, the location of this part. In this step, we simply need to stick it on. Don't be in a hurry to tear off the paper from the double-sided tape, because we still have to handle other areas. Now stick it on. It's just because we stick it on at this step. It's easier to stick it on neatly. After sticking it well, we first flip to the front side of this fabric piece. Shape the collar like I'm doing now. Pull these two pieces of fabric flat like this. Fold down the top piece of the collar like this. Then fold the seam underneath upwards. Fold upwards along the seam line. The fold position should align perfectly with the seam below. After folding, we draw a line here to secure the group. Please note that we need to align with the front and back pieces below. Draw a line along the edge of the opening at the back. Do not draw the line too close to the edge seam. After drawing the line, trim this seam slightly. Just leave about 3 millimeters. At the right angle on top, make a diagonal snip. Do not cut into the seam line. Then we will use the same method. Fold and sew this other side as well. After finishing, trim this seam as well. Next, we will focus on this seam area. Fold the entire seam. First, create this fold. When we turn it over later, this area does not need to be folded. This step will be easier. You can use an iron to press the fold. It will be more even. The shaping will be improved. Then we position the two ends of the collar. Turn it to the side. Use tweezers to assist. Push out the right angle position. The other side is the same. At this point, we will remove the one we just pasted. The paper on this double-sided tape, tear it off, leave the adhesive part. After tearing it off, we will use what we just heated. The horizontal fold position, it perfectly covers collar and the neckline of both the front and back pieces. The position of the stitched seam, the entire strip has been securely adhered. Next, we turn it to the front side. At this specific location, on the left side, use a visible thread to secure it. Because the starting area of the neckline is thicker, so we can fold a piece of fabric, it's about the same thickness as this position. Place it in front of the pressing corner. When we are side sewing, this position is not easy to sew in place continuously because it is already secured. So in this step, we will do the side sewing again. It will be easier to sew on the side. If you don't use double-sided tape, actually it's not a problem. As long as you can drive it, that's fine. The tape merely serves an auxiliary role. It will just drive a bit better. This is how it looks after the measurement. Now let's talk about it. The side seam beneath the lining's embroidery frame. Sew it together with the right sides facing each other. The side seam beneath the embroidery frame on the other side. Also sew with the right sides facing each other. The two side seams of the lining. It looks like this after taking measurements. Sew in the middle to split it apart on both sides. You can use a pressing tool to smooth it out. Make it smoother. Then we will take the sleeves from the front section, fold it in half towards the front, connect it to the side seams of the front and back pieces below. Sew along the seam line together. After measuring, we will make marks around the underarm area. Make some notches on this seam. Once the notch is done, we'll use the same method. Repeat the process for the other sleeve. Then we flip the sleeve to the right side. We'll set this part aside for now. Let's work on the skirt section. The skirt section. Let's start with the lace at the bottom. The dimensions of the lace shown in the drawing. Add extra seam allowance before cutting it out. This sewing machine, I drew it on the front side of the fabric. If it's drawn on the front side of the fabric, when we fold the bottom edge to the back side, we hem the edge. Can you see this sewing machine? It will be easier to fold. Here we will work with the entire bottom edge and fold it along the sewing line. Measure a line to fix it in place. I am measuring a line of about 1 millimeter here. If you like it wider, you can also measure wider, based on your preference. Then in this step shown in the video, you'll see how there's an extra line on the left side. This is something I drew extra. Just ignore it. Then we will take the other long side to create a double line fold. Double line tucks refer to the stitching we are doing here, approximately 2 millimeters from both the left and right sides. Sew a tuck line. The stitch spacing for this tuck line can be slightly wider. Use a stitch length of 4.5 or 5, because for instance, the size I'm working on now, it measures 4 points. It is quite long. If you use a standard spacing of 4 for this, it can be a bit challenging to tuck. Just go according to the actual situation. If you normally make small pieces of that small size, you can normally use a sewing distance of 4. For larger sizes, you can use 4.5 or 5. Be careful not to tack at both ends of the folded line. Leave more thread. Then we pull both bottom threads tight at the same time. Pull out the tuck. One side feels tight, making it hard to pull. Let's change the two bottom lines on the other side. The size after completing the lace gathering lines and the outer hem of our underskirt. The length of the bottom edge is consistent. After making the adjustments, we will place them face to face. Sew along the sewing line. Check the folded paper after measuring, if there are no issues. Then remove the gathering stitches from the front. Then we will turn this joint position to the front to turn it to the front. Process it to the visible seam to make this position a bit flatter. Then, at this position of the outer skirt's waistband, we will also do a double line tuck. I won't repeat the method for the double line tuck here. It's the same as the lace we just did. Then, we will take the waistband position of the inner skirt, and we will also tuck it. The dimension of the inner skirt hem, we follow what is written on the drawings. The bottom edge does not need to be modified. Then the remaining positions need to add style. Because of this, I used mesh cloth. The bottom edge of the mesh fabric does not need to be hemmed, so the style of the bottom edge can be trimmed off. The other 3 edges should be normally extended by 5 millimeters. Then we will position the long edge at the waist. Do a double line pleat like just now. The size of the mesh after gathering in the front and back pieces of our lining. The size of the bottom edge after unfolding is consistent. Here we will sew it together with the right sides facing each other. Remove the part that needs to be Next, we will use the same method to gather the outer skirt after it has been gathered with the bottom edge of the front and back pieces of the outer layer facing each other. Sew along the seam line. After all the skirts of the lining and outer layer are sewn together, we will turn it to the front side. Sew a seam at this position separately. Fix the visible thread. After changing, we will turn the fabric to the reverse side. This means that the lining and the outer fabric face each other. Previously, we worked on the opening at the back. At the top here, the neckline is sewn down 2/3. Now we proceed from this 2/3 position. Sew straight down completely. When we reach the end, you will find that this mesh section will be a little shorter than the outer skirt. This is not an issue. Just sew up to where this mesh fades away. The back opening on the other, if we're making this vest, let's first talk about its lining. The lining I used for this is mesh fabric. Mesh fabric is elastic. If it's small fabric and 6 points, it is recommended to use mesh fabric. Its shoulder position will be easier to turn, especially for small pieces of fabric. If you use the regular lining fabric, it has no elasticity and will be quite difficult to handle. It might even be difficult to flip over. A 6-point rating will be a bit better. If the sisters with better skills are more skilled at flipping, you can use this ordinary lining for a 6-point as well. A 4-point can be flipped over with ease. You can choose this yourself. Then at this point, the elastic direction of the fabric underneath is like this. Then take out the fabric that we have patterned and layer it together. Pay attention to the fabric below. Its stretch direction is horizontal. It can be stretched horizontally. If stretched horizontally, we flip this part over. The mesh in this part, it is indeed elastic. If you maintain this elasticity straight, then you've wasted this part. So let's stitch it together first. To channel on this tablecloth, set the mesh aside first. Regarding the pattern here, the position of the embroidery hoop and the center collar. I haven't trimmed the stitching on this side. If you want to trim, you can do so. A 5mm seam will suffice because it uses mesh fabric. So I prefer to wait until it's finished, then I'll trim it at the end. The position of the front and back bottom edges, the seam on this side must be trimmed. Just leave a 5mm seam. Now the side of the fabric facing up is the wrong side of the fabric. Then we will take care of this area. Fold it like this. Make sure the 2 diagonal sides of the rope overlap each other. Then we sew from the bottom edge position to the position between the provinces. When sewing here, pay attention to the beginning part. We need to backstitch. But when the sewing reaches the end, we don't need to backstitch. This is the point where the car reaches the tip. Don't stop. Keep pushing the sewing machine forward. Step on it a little faster. Just take it all the way out. Don't cut the wire too short. Leave a little section. Then let's take a look at this section. It is twisted together like a piece of hemp rope. Of course, we shouldn't intentionally poke it open with our hands, because poking it here will cause it to fall apart. Due to the space between the provinces, we didn't go to get the booster. So if it turns to the front side, this location, It will appear more visually appealing. It will be somewhat smoother. If you have an injection at this position, it flips to the front. This area will have a more vintage look. I haven't trimmed this wire. It looks just like this. A long piece will suffice. But if you keep it in this state, it is twisted together. You can't poke it apart. Because usually, under normal conditions with a standard scale, instead of mesh. If it's mesh, you can see this line. So there are some close friends if you're using mesh fabric for your inner balance. Then we have another method. It's simply this line. Let's leave it a bit longer. Tie a knot in it. When the car reaches the tip, we can stop it there. Then pull the line out. Don't give the injection back. It's also about pulling the line out. Tie a regular knot with the two lines. That's enough. After tying the final knot, trim off the excess parts. Use whichever method you prefer. Then just use that method. Anyway, we just avoid injecting at sharp points, like this. It's more aesthetically pleasing when we turn it to the front. We still have 3 provinces left here. Use the same method to finish it properly. Then take out our mesh fabric. At this moment, it's the same. I mentioned it earlier. Its elasticity is horizontal like this. We place it down like this. Then we take the cloth we just prepared carefully and stack it face down on top, especially meeting at both sides of the display frame, and the position of the neckline in the center. After measuring, we use a bamboo pin to secure the 2 pieces of fabric together slightly. The areas that were not stitched earlier, we leave a standard 5 millimeters, that is, along the edge of this tablecloth. Trim off the excess part of this mesh fabric, the other 3 areas we just sewed. Generally, we can use pinking shears to trim it, but the fabric I'm using is particularly prone to fraying, so I can't use pinking shears. I just use regular scissors. First, trim this style a bit narrower. Leave a margin of about 2 to 3 millimeters. Then cut straight into the cut opening. Everyone should assess their own fabric situation if it's not the type that easily frays. Then you can just trim the lace as usual. I am using a double bow needle thread. All curved areas. All of them should have some cuts made. Otherwise, when you flip it to the front later. This position is not flat, all trimmed. The inside of the mesh is like this. Then use hemostatic forceps. Pass it from this point on the shoulder to the back piece, because it uses mesh fabric, so it is very easy to pass through here. Hold the fabric of the back piece in place, pull it forward. If you feel resistance, just pull it a little closer. Then you can switch hands to pull it over. Don't keep using the hemostat, because if you use the hemostat, sometimes pulling too hard can cause it to tear. After pulling it over, let's tidy up this position a little. We'll use the same method. Pull the back piece from the other side over here. Also pull it to the front. After flipping it over, I am now tidying up the edges here. It's the seam position we just sewed. I have tidied and ironed them. The area that was set aside hasn't been ironed yet. Let me specifically discuss this, how to press the position of the seam. Let's first turn to the back side of the fabric. The direction of the seam should be towards the side seam. For example, this is the seam on the left side. We will pour it over to the left side seam. It's convenient for everyone to see here. I am wearing heat-resistant gloves on my hands. It's pressed directly on this glove. When you are curling your hair at home, you can use that kind of small stool or something like that. Anyway, don't do it like I do. What I'm doing is a dangerous move, mainly to make it easier for everyone to understand. It's better to watch this. Then we maintain the direction of the style underneath. Iron it a bit in the front part too. Be careful when ironing. After we drove to this province, this area is 3-dimensional. So when you're curling it, you shouldn't flatten this area like this. For example, if I'm using gloves here, I use my fingertips, press down on this area, allow it to puff up a bit, press it down like this to apply heat. Once it's heated, let's compare the differences on both sides. The left side is the one that hasn't been ironed yet. The right side is the one that has already been ironed. This distinction is also quite obvious. Next, we have the same method. Let's iron the other 3 provinces as well. Pay attention to the remaining 3 provinces. Each province is leaning towards its own side. The side seam on its own side is turned over. This position is right under the rusty cage. Now let's discuss this. A sewing method for standard inner scales. First, we need the standard inner scale. We need to match the surface fabric. Sew all the areas that are trimmed. The method for sewing the trimmed sections. We refer to the first video. After the sewing is done, the lining and the outer fabric are facing each other. Then we sew the neckline and the positions of the side cages. This is how it looks once the car is ready. Then we proceed, just like in the first video. Go ahead and trim and sew the edges. Then use the hemostatic tape to flip it to the front. Just give it a quick overall ironing, and you're done. This is what it looks like after I finished processing it. Then we bring the front and back together. We merge the side seams at this position. Lining fabric facing lining fabric. Outer fabric facing outer fabric. Align the position of the central style, sew directly along the edge of this style line. If this side is finished sewing, we will continue sewing the other side. Unfold it to the same position as well. Sew along the style line. Then unfold the style at the position we just stitched. Unfold the lining and the outer fabric together. This position can be pressed with a steam iron. Press it with steam. Make it a little smoother. The same method is applied to the other side. Then handle the bottom edge of the vest. This stitched lace part, according to the dimensions given in the drawing. Additionally, trim the style of the 4 edges. The line solution used for drawing. I'm drawing on the front of the fabric. If it is drawn on the front of the fabric, when we fold this bottom edge to the reverse side, This thread is easier to fold. Then here we fold the entire bottom edge inward along the line. Fold it towards the back side. Tuck the edges in. I measured a thread that is 1 millimeter thick. If you prefer it a bit wider, you can also measure a wider line. The other edge should have a double stitch at 2 millimeters to the left and right of this seam line. Sew the fold line. First, use the forefront and back without re-injecting the needle. Then, tighten the two bottom lines at the same time. Take this one out. One side feels tighter now. Then switch to pulling the two bottom lines on the other side. After determining the dimensions, we will focus on the upper part. The bottom edge of this fabric is uniform. Once the length is adjusted, we will sew them together with the front sides facing one another. Along the design line, when measuring the seam, pay attention to its start positionally. We focus on the side seam. We ironed it quite close to the side seam. Now when dealing with the side seam, it also goes back to where it originally was. For example, based on the direction I'm facing now, the first province I encounter is facing down. The second province is facing up. The third province is once again facing down. The fourth province is also oriented upwards. Additionally, this method, when the car reaches the side seam position, allow it to separate to both sides. Check it after the car is ready. If there are no issues, let's take off the pull line we just mentioned. Next, we'll take the entire bottom edge from the inside. Fold it to the opposite side. Fold along the design line. Once it's folded properly, we place this opening at the back. The inside and the outside are aligned together. Sew down along the seam line. The position of the crease on this edge that we just folded. This position aligns perfectly with the one stitched below. Just keep retracting until you reach the crease here. After measuring, check to see if this side is perfectly aligned. Then, we will use the same method. There are two methods for making this hat. One method is to directly use hemp yarn to trim the edges and add decorations. The other method involves using hemp yarn inside, or if stiff interfacing is used. Then, add fabric at the top and bottom to encase the middle layer. I tested this linen yarn with my own Le Chauby, and it can draw lines, but I'm worried that some of my friends have pens that aren't great for drawing. So I'm going to use a different method here. Clip the drawing and the linen yarn together for her. Trim directly along the edges of the drawing. This does not need to be kept for sewing. We just need to be the same size as the drawings. After cutting, touch the edge with your hand. You will find that it is a bit prickly here. So next we will proceed with the edging operation. I measured the lace trim used for the edging. It's about 9 millimeters. This width can be adjusted according to your preference. If you prefer it wider, you can use a wider lace or ribbon. If you prefer it narrower, however, it's not easy to adjust this size if you want it to be narrower. In any case, select the lace width according to your actual needs. Next, we begin edging from the back, which is this straight edge. This is because this is the position at the back of our hat. It's definitely better to place it at the back than at the front, because from the front, it cannot be seen on the street. Then we cover the edge with this lace. We sew it in place while wrapping. I want to especially mention that this lace is lightweight and warm, if I only wrap it once. After it's finally wrapped, if you touch the edges, there will still be some sharp spots. So here, after I finished one round, I continued and did another round. If you only do one round, it's important to pay attention to the positions of the start and end. Allow it to overlap slightly. This way, the joint won't be very noticeable. Overlapping by about 1 centimeter will suffice. You can complete a circle and then check the position of the edges. If it doesn't feel prickly, you don't need to check the second round. If you still feel a bit prickly, then you check one more round. Then we trim off the excess lace. This hat accessory is ready again. Let's set it aside for now. Next, let's handle the lace. As for this lace, this is what I finally made as the finished product. There are wave edges on both sides. If you can purchase this type of finished product, because there are similar finished products. You can also purchase the finished product directly. If there isn't a suitable option, then you can use this lace just like I do. Then we'll stitch it together. First, let's create a piece of lace. We'll take this wavy edge as the reference. Draw a line upwards. The distance of this line is brace. For example, what I have on the drawing is 3 centimeters, multiplied by several dozen centimeters. Half of the 3 before, if what is written before is 3 centimeters, so this is 1.5. If it is written as 4 centimeters, then it is 2 centimeters. The length of a single lace edge is what I have written on my drawing, which is relatively long. This length of about several centimeters, we need 2 pieces of equal length. After we finish drawing, we take out another lace piece. Be aware, if there are changes with opposing sides, then we position them to face each other. You only need to draw the line on one of the decorative edges. Then we arrange them to face one another, overlapping with each other. Sew directly along this line. Trim it a little after sewing. Leave a seam allowance of about 3 millimeters. Then spread the seam allowance to both sides. You can iron it to press it flat. After processing it well, the front side of the edging looks like this. A dimension of the finished edging provided on my drawing. It's a dimension after we have assembled it. Then we need to handle this edging. Pull it over the hat. The starting position for drawing the edge, you can fold it inward a little. You can fold it to about 1 centimeter thick, like 7 grains of rice. This should be good enough. What I'm doing here, the beginning and the final part, all have a little space left. This can also be adjusted based on your preferences. If you prefer more space, just add more. Or you might prefer to fill it completely. That's also fine. including if you like to cover the side area. If you want to block it, then you can move it a little to the right. I don't want to block it. You can just move a little to the left. That's also fine, because I made several types of hats this time. Each of my positions is actually quite different. For example, this one, my painting edge is sewn a bit more to the right. This edge position has been covered. The painting edge of this one being filmed now is placed a bit more to the left. The edge position is not obstructed. Then we proceed along this seam. We directly sew along this center line. While sewing, we manually fold. First, secure this small section at the start, then stop first. Pinch this fabric with your hands. Press it forward to make a fold. Then sew a few stitches forward. Secure this fold. Keep repeating this operation. Repeatedly stack this fold. There's no overlap between each fold. It feels somewhat like how we create folding groups. Of course, if you prefer a different approach, you can also adjust it according to your preferences. In any case, we try to keep each section fairly even. There shouldn't be any sections that are especially large. It's okay if some sections are quite small. The vehicle is nearing the end. We need to pay attention to this. There is a distance between the front lace and the prototype. So when we finish here, we also need to stay away from the edge of this prototype. In the end, there is a distance here. We need to stop here in advance. You shouldn't wait until you get to the spot to stop, because we need to trim the excess edges of the drawing. Avoid cutting it too precisely. Leave a bit around 1 centimeter. Then we fold it back. After folding, draw the edge's position. The distance from this edge to the two sides is quite consistent. Then we take the last little bit, just sew it down a bit more, and that will be fine. Next, we take out a ribbon. This ribbon is the strap for our hat, its length. You can adjust it according to your preference. You can let it grow a bit longer first. Let it grow a bit longer. Make sure to dress the child properly at the end. After securing it well, you think it looks long, you can trim it again. Place the ribbon underneath to create a border, a position that is relatively centered. Then take a narrower one, this decorative ribbon, place it in the center, sew it in one go, the ribbon and this narrower band, secure them all. The needle position is at the start of the lace. The final stopping position, this is where the lace stops. This is how I sew. I do it all in one go. If you're not sure, it can also be done in 2 parts. First, secure this ribbon. Once the ribbon is secured, then secure the strap above. After everything has been taken down, we trim off the excess parts at both ends. Then we tie 2 bows by hand, sew it in this position. Finally, we tie the rope onto it. You can tie it directly to the tightest level. Then we spray some water upwards. If there is no spray bottle, you can just throw it directly into the water. Let it soak for a few seconds. Use your hands to feel. This curvature isn't smooth enough. The position isn't appealing enough. Make a few more adjustments. Then we wait for this mortar. Once it's completely dry, the shape of it will have a natural arc like this. Next, let's discuss the second method. Regarding the second method, divided into 2 types of materials. One is that we use this masha in the middle. The masha part also doesn't require a seam. We place a piece of fabric underneath it. Then, along the edge of the masha, the thread secures this fabric. After measuring, cut off the excess fabric. Don't cut into the sandpaper part. We only cut the fabric at the bottom. After cutting, we place the fabric underneath with the right side facing up. Then, just like in the first video, we will work on top of it. Place this lace, and all the ribbons and ties should be set up properly. Let's not worry about this side for now. After we finish removing the lace, we will handle this side later, because after we finish measuring, there will be a line agent. It is visible. If we cover this side right now, and after covering it with fabric, then if we proceed to sew the lace, the thread on this side will be more noticeable. This section on the car's trim, we refer to the first video. It's the same method. Then you flip it over to check. You can see the line agent here. At this moment, we will cover this layer of fabric again to cover it. The recently stitched seam will be blocked. Then we will do it again. Along this edge, sew a circle around it. Fix this layer of fabric at the back. Also secure it. If this fabric, there are also distinctions between the front and back. You can see that its backside is facing up. Next, the lace and ribbon on top. The area of our driveway. Just push it to the side a bit. Do not sew to this lace or the ribbon is missing. After sewing along the edge of this unfinished product, trim off the excess fabric. After trimming, we use the method from the first video. For edging to cover this edge area, just cover it all around. After finishing the edges, let's take a look. The backside looks like this. It cannot see the thread, but if using hemp yarn, it has a disadvantage. It's just like this for us. When we bend it down, because the hat is put on, this position is curved. Look at the inner layer of fabric. It will swell up. Of course, if some of the ladies, it is at the position in the inner layer where the salt is seeping out. It might have some embellishments added. Cover this raised part, cover it. That works too, because I'm not in there. Add any decorations. So I think if it puffs up like this inside, it doesn't look very good. I personally prefer the method of using a heated technique inside. I will discuss this next. One method of using a hot scale. However, using a hot scale, there is also a drawback. That means in the end, it is unable to fixed after spraying. It stands very upright. If we don't set it properly, typically placed there, it is just a flat surface. Using linen yarn, we can be like the first video, the last one, because it is vertical. There is an additional layer of fabric, so we don't need to spray water. Instead, we soak it directly for a while. Let this fabric penetrate into the hemp yarn within. After it dries completely, there will be a natural curve. If we are going to use this, a relatively harder styling tool. Let's first take a look at both sides. This is a single-sided heat scale. It has one side is rough and sticky, the other side is smooth, it is not sticky. Let's first take the reverse side of this fabric, and this smooth side, that is non-sticky. This side of the iron is facing, which is right now. The reverse side of our fabric is facing up. The top side has a sticky finish. This side is also facing up. After aligning along the edge of this ironing board, sew around the perimeter, attach the fabric to the ironing board. Once secured, trim the excess fabric, don't cut into the hot tool. Now this is the side that is facing up. This side is the sticky one. Turn it over to this side. We have already cut this fabric. This side has been cleared. It is non-sticky. We are on this side. Directly add decorative lace to it. It's the same as the first video. I have completed the decoration here. Now let's take a look at this side. Take out the fabric we prepared. Cover it up. This fabric is facing up. The underside is the back side.
Here we're going to make the group title. We'll cut out the size of our group name directly according to the drawing. There's no need to add any incorrect seams. Then we will fold it in half. The folded edge is the shorter edge. Then we measure a channel at this horizontal position on the right. This side needs to thread through the elastic band. For example, if you use the 2mm elastic band, then you measure a line of about 4mm. For example, using a 3mm elastic band, then you measure a 5mm thread for it. After threading, it should look like this. Then we use a separator to thread the elastic band through it. If you don't have a separator, you can use other tools. Anything like a large pin is fine. As long as the elastic band can go through, that's enough. The size drawing for the elastic band includes a reference. Then we secure its two ends. Next, we overlap the two ends together. If your mesh has a front and back side, that means the front sides should face each other. Leave a 5mm seam along the edge. Then trim the seam slightly to tidy it up. Flip it to the front side, and you're all set. Let's do some contour stitching here. First, let's make a few cuts along this edge. This is on the lining. Avoid making the cuts too deep. Fold it in, inner fold, fold while scraping it with your nails. Shape it a bit. After finishing the inner fold, we take this part from the inside of our watch, this seam of the cuff, pull it slightly outward, align it with the inside. You can use a pin to secure it. There is a pointed seam on top. Then the sharp seam on the surface will also align with it. There is a side seam here. The side seam at the bottom also aligns with the side seam inside. Be careful not to prick your hand. Let's sew it together now. When we reach the surface part while sewing, it must be on this seam. Definitely do not sew into the fabric of the surface. Otherwise, it will be visible when you flip it over from the front. I am currently on this seam. It's just a stitch went into the seam of the outer fabric. Then we will bring the needle to it. Directly fold the edges we have folded inward. Give it a shot. If the long needle method is used well by the sisters, using the long needle method can make it more aesthetically pleasing. If you don't use it well, there's no problem with using this method. A needle goes through. The above is the inner part. Then below is the seam of the table. Just repeat this. After finishing one round of stitching, you can just tie a knot here. If we stitch to the surface, you will see the thread at this edge. So we can't sew onto the surface. We can only sew onto the seam. That's it, we're done. Now let's demonstrate the long stitch method. First, the thread end is hidden inside the fabric. We need to pull the thread out from the fabric. Align with this point to bring the needle into another piece of fabric above. Can we see directly from this point? This point is the same as that point. Then we insert from here into this place. The distance between the needle entry and exit here is approximately 3 millimeters. It's okay if you make it a bit denser when you do it. Next, insert the needle at the same spot on the fabric below. Exit the needle approximately 3 millimeters away. The following steps are also repeated. It's just a matter of going up and down continuously. Once the reverse suturing is done, you can pull this thread tight. Directly tie a knot with the needle. Then thread the needle through the fabric. Pull it a little tighter. The thread is hidden inside. Good. Send it to the designated location.